An intellectual autobiography, from mathematics through physics to both engineering and medicine. Part 1, number 1724, July 21, 2026. Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Research Journey. Preface: Early this morning, I had an interesting dream. In the dream, I was attending an engineering course on finite element methods. The classroom was filled with students from different educational background and experience levels. Many of them were struggling to understand the fundamental concepts. In the dream, I joined the class as the CEO of an engineering design firm. Having both a solid academic foundation and many years of practical engineering experience, I quickly understood the concepts and completed the homework assignment with ease. Several classmates then asked me, "How could you finish so quickly? You only joined the class near the end." When I woke up around 6 a.m., I kept thinking about that dream. It reminded me that understanding often depends not only on intelligence, but also on having the right conceptual framework. Once the underlying engineering principles are understood, many seemingly different problems can be viewed from the same perspective. That realization led me to an interesting question: could the fundamental concepts of finite element methods provide a simple engineering analogy for understanding the relationship between food selection, nutrition, and postprandial glucose? This paper presents one possible engineering perspective. Introduction. Finite element methods provide a useful engineering analogy for understanding the relationship between food selection and postprandial glucose (ppg) in finite element analysis. Engineers first define the loading conditions before calculating the structural response. Likewise, in human metabolism, the selected food ingredients, their quantities, and their combination determine the primary nutritional input to the body. The total amount of digestible carbohydrate, including its sugar and starch components, represents the major metabolic load of a meal. Cooking certainly influences how quickly nutrients are digested and absorbed, but it usually does not fundamentally change the nutritional composition of the selected ingredients. Therefore, the most important decision is made before cooking, choosing the proper ingredients and controlling their portions. The human body then processes this nutritional load according to its own physiological characteristics. Factors such as insulin secretion, insulin resistance, digestive efficiency, and overall metabolic health influence how the nutritional input is converted into blood glucose. These biological characteristics differ from one individual to another, just as different engineering materials, steel or concrete, respond differently to the same applied load. Although the relationship between carbohydrate intake and postprandial glucose is not perfectly linear, my long-term observations indicate that, within ordinary operating range, it behaves as an approximately pseudo-linear relationship. In general, meals containing more digestible carbohydrate produce higher postprandial glucose levels. From this engineering viewpoint, food selection determines the primary metabolic input, while the body's pathophysiology determines how that input is processed. Therefore, improving postprandial glucose control begins by controlling the input rather than reacting only to the output. Conclusion of this preface: this finite element analogy is not intended to replace nutritional science or pathophysiology. Instead, it provides a simple engineering framework for understanding a complex biomedical process. Just as engineers achieve better structural performance by carefully designing the applied loading conditions, we can reduce metabolic stress by carefully selecting food ingredients and appropriate portion sizes before a meal begins. Viewed from this engineering perspective, effective glucose control starts in the grocery store and the kitchen, not after the meal has already been eaten. The most important intervention is not correcting the output, but designing the input. From linear elasticity to viscoplastic medicine, a finite element analogy discussed previously represents only the simplest level of applying engineering concepts to human health. My own engineering education gradually expanded this framework over many years. During my undergraduate studies in applied mathematics in Taiwan and later in mechanical engineering and computer science at the University of Iowa, I studied the theory of elasticity, static mechanics, and biomechanics from Professor James Andrews. These subjects describe materials operating within their elastic range. When an external load is applied, the material deforms. Once the load is removed, it returns completely to its original shape without any permanent deformation. Within this operating range, the relationship between loading and deformation is often approximated as linear and static. This concept provides a useful first-order analogy for food nutrition and postprandial glucose under relatively stable human physiological conditions. Increasing the nutritional load generally increases the glucose response in an approximately pseudo-linear manner, although biological systems are more complicated than engineering materials. This simplified model captures the dominant relationship between nutritional input and metabolic output. My advanced engineering perspective changed significantly after entering MIT, where I studied under Professor Norman Jones. There I learned that many real engineering systems no longer behave as simple linear elastic materials. Once the applied loading exceeds the elastic limit, the material enters a nonlinear and inelastic region. When the load is eventually removed, the material cannot fully recover. Permanent deformation remains. In engineering, this behavior is described as plasticity. Another important group of subjects I studied throughout my education, including in Taiwan, at the University of Iowa, Stevens Institute of Technology, Columbia University, UC Berkeley, and MIT, included fluid dynamics, soil mechanics, and bridge design, and like static solids, fluids are continuously changing with time. Their motion depends not only on the applied forces but also on viscosity, which governs the rate at which deformation develops. When the concepts of viscosity and plasticity are combined, they produce viscoplastic behavior. Such materials exhibit three important characteristics. The responses are dynamic because they evolve continuously with time. They're mathematical. Relationships are nonlinear rather than simple straight lines. Most importantly, once significant deformation has occurred, part of the damage becomes permanent. Plastic deformation. Human health follows a remarkably similar pattern. A young, healthy person behaves much like a linear elastic system. Physical activity, emotional stress, insufficient sleep, or radical dietary challenges may temporarily disturb the body's internal balance. Once the disturbance disappears, the physiological system gradually returns to its normal operating state without permanent damage. Disease represents a fundamentally different operating condition. As chronic diseases develop, biomedical systems gradually lose their ability to return completely to their original healthy state. For example, in type 2 diabetes, elevated glucose levels no longer return naturally to the normal range after each metabolic challenge. Instead, a higher operating level gradually becomes established. Similar progressive and partially irreversible changes occur in many other chronic illnesses and certain mortality diseases I have suffered personally, such as vascular disease, chronic kidney disease, neurodegenerative disorders, and diabetic retinopathy. These biomedical processes are dynamic because they continuously evolve. With time, they are nonlinear because the relationships among the governing variables become nonlinear and increasingly complex. They are plastic because accumulated physiological damage cannot always be completely reversed. From an engineering viewpoint, pathology can therefore be viewed as the viscoplastic operating regime of human physiology. Physiology describes the normal behavior of a healthy biological system, whereas pathology describes the altered behavior after disease has changed the system's operating characteristics. This engineering framework eventually became the conceptual foundation of my own medical research, leading to the development of what I later called the viscoplastic medicine theory (VMT). From engineering theory to medical religious, I continue writing this paper. I realized something that surprises even me. After publishing more than 1,720 medical research papers, I have never taken the time to explain to my readers, using the most fundamental concepts of physics and engineering, how my mathematics, physics, and engineering background shaped both my research methodology and my understanding of physiology and pathology. The engineering principles discussed in the previous sections were not developed to explain medicine. I learned them many decades before I entered medical research. Only after experiencing chronic metabolic disease myself did I begin to recognize that the behavior of engineering materials and the behavior of the human body share many remarkably similar characteristics. When I first came to the United States, I weighed approximately 140 pounds, as I gradually adapted to the abundant American food supply and certain and healthy lifestyle. My body weight increased year after year. By approximately age 35, my BMI had exceeded 25, placing me in the overweight category. By about age 40, my BMI exceeded 30, and I became obese. My body weight eventually reached approximately 230 pounds, representing a 90-pound increase from the time I arrived in the United States as a 21-year-old young man. Looking back today, I believe that I developed type 2 diabetes during that period of prolonged obesity. One of the earliest warning signs occurred in the Hong Kong airport. I suddenly became dizzy and had to sit down on the floor. My sister immediately bought me a cup of fruit juice because she believed my glucose had fallen to low. After drinking the juice, I recovered quickly. At that time, I did not understand what had happened. Looking back now, however, I believe that my glucose regulation had already become severely abnormal. A healthy person's glucose generally remains within a relatively stable physiological range. Mine appeared capable of dropping to dangerously low levels, perhaps below 60 mg DL or even approaching 50 mg DL, before rapidly rising to extremely high levels, approaching beyond 200 mg DL after consuming juice. Such large fluctuations reflected an abnormal metabolic control system. Although I did not recognize their significance at that time, several years later, while walking outside a hospital in Taipei, I noticed a free blood glucose screening station. A nurse performed a fingerstick glucose test and immediately told me that my blood glucose measured approximately 360 mg DL. She strongly advised me to enter the hospital because I was almost certainly suffering from severe type 2 diabetes. That roadside glucose test finally confirmed what my body had already been signaling for several years. Looking back, I estimate that I developed type 2 diabetes at approximately 44 years of age. Today, I am nearly 80 years old, giving me a history of approximately 36 years of living with type 2 diabetes. Interestingly, throughout those decades I was never a patient with chronic hypertension. My cholesterol occasionally approached the upper limit of normal but was never severely elevated. Therefore, from a clinical perspective, my two dominant metabolic disorders were severe obesity and long-standing type 2 diabetes. Together, these two disorders became the foundation of nearly all of the subsequent damage to my health. The progression was slow but relentless. Beginning in 1994, I experienced 2 heart attacks. By 2004, I had suffered a total of 5 cardiovascular events. By 2010, my chronic kidney disease had progressed to the point that my physicians recommended dialysis. That recommendation became a major turning point in my life. During the same period, I developed severe diabetic neuropathy that nearly resulted in toe amputation. My physicians explained that patients requiring toe amputation or long-term kidney dialysis often have a life expectancy of only 5 to 10 years. At that time, I was 63 years old, which implied that I might not live beyond the age of 68 to 73. Also in 2010, I was diagnosed with diabetic retinopathy, placing my eyesight at serious risk. These experiences gradually changed the way I viewed chronic disease. Heart attacks and kidney failure can directly threaten life. Neuropathy and retinopathy may not immediately cause death, but they can permanently disable a patient through amputation or blindness. For this reason, I began grouping these complications together as mortality diseases, although their clinical manifestations differ. They all originated from the same long-term metabolic disorders, obesity and type 2 diabetes, and they all eventually threaten either survival or quality of life. The final major event occurred in 2025, when I suffered a hemorrhagic stroke in the pontine region of my brain. From my engineering perspective, the underlying cause of my stroke was not simply an isolated episode of an acute elevated blood pressure. Rather, more than 3 decades of diabetes had gradually damaged and calcified my cerebral microvascular system. The acute blood pressure spike became the triggering event, but the vascular structure had already been weakened by years of chronic metabolic disease. This experience further strengthened my engineering interpretation of chronic disease. Once pathological damage reaches the cellular level, complete recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult. Tissues may undergo some degree of partial repair. Organs may recover part of their function. However, damage at the cellular level is fundamentally different. Cells cannot simply be restored to their original healthy condition after decades of accumulated injury. The calcification of my brain's microblood vessels belongs to this type of cellular damage. Cancer illustrates another example of disease occurring at the cellular level. Once normal cells have undergone pathological transformation, treatment becomes extremely difficult because the disease originates within the body's own cells. This understanding also shaped my view of pharmaceutical treatment. Modern medications have tremendous value. They can eliminate external biological invaders such as bacteria and viruses, reduce many clinical risks, and help control disease progression. However, from my engineering perspective, There is no medication that can selectively enter the body, identify every chronically damaged cell, restore each damaged cell completely to its original healthy condition, and leave every normal cell untouched. For this reason, I believe that medications primarily mitigate disease and reduce its consequences. They do not fundamentally reverse the chronic cellular damage produced by decades of metabolic disorders. This realization completely changed my research direction. Instead of asking only how to treat disease through medications after irreversible damage had already occurred, I began asking a different engineering question: what long-term mechanisms gradually transform a healthy physiological system into a pathological one? That question ultimately became the foundation of my engineering approach to medicine and the development of my viscoplastic medicine theory (VMT). This is part 1.